Harmer, Brenda Ray Harmer, whose name sounds like he comes from a Faulkner novel. Where does the name Brenda come from? You wonder. He's in Wartburg prison and has apparently been given a new neighbor. He's a member of the Crips gang, and he has a letter to Warden Phillips. He says, you, Sergeant Garner, and Mr. Hutchinson knowingly and intentionally placed a gang member who assaulted me in Unit 1, Cell 10 on October 30. Notified staff that day. I notified staff that day and wrote you and Sergeant Garner by mail. I was notified Mr. Hutchinson personally at 9:25 a.m. So this man is like me. He keeps records and he is astute on the facts. He goes into the particulars. On November 1, one more paragraph. On November 1, 2017, Unit 1 staff allowed the gang member who assaulted me, was allowed to recreation with me, he says. That's not quite grammatical. I had an argument with one of the gang members' friends about it. I'm requesting both inmates in cell 10 be moved. And I got a response this morning by Nasa Taylor, the flack of the Department of Correction. And she says, your correspondent, which she puts in quotes, your correspondent knows the procedure for getting an incompatible designation to be put on somebody to avoid a conflict. So that is the news from the prison system. I have an essay going out that describes some of the pettifogging abuses in the state slave system. We do, and don't be shocked by that expression. We do have slavery today, but state slavery is the only kind that's permitted. Private chattel slavery, of course, abolished by the war to prevent Southern independence. But state slavery is the norm, and there are tens of thousands of members in that establishment run by Tennessee government, and Brenda Harmer is one of them. It's all controlled by statute, and there are limits to what can be done abusively against a particular member. Now, we're talking with Dave Buck. Dave is the executive director of the Chattanooga Autism Center. He's been in that job for 5 years. As a family man, he and his wife, Karen, have two children, ages 13 and 17, lives on Signal Mountain. He's 48 years old. And he's his job at the Autism Center, vis-a-vis an important element of, you might say, threat and force in Chattanooga. His work with the center is to bring some sweetness and some grace and some patience to that particular body and the individuals in that massed body. And there I'm referring to law enforcement in the area, even in North Georgia, law enforcement officers in police departments and sheriff's departments, and even as we hear from him from the Department of Correction or Core Civic in our area, attend a class given once or twice a year now for several years in the Chattanooga area, in which there are up to 30 people per year taking a class on what's called de-escalation. Now, de-escalation is a terrific concept, and as you, my listener, have followed our work here at Nooga Radio, and we're going to hear how that works. What is de-escalation? What are the mechanics of it? What is the human soul, if you will, in de-escalation? This is David Tulis, your host. We're here at Nooga Radio, and I do thank you for giving me just a couple minutes of your time. We argue for a local economy and the free market, suggesting that if you love your neighbor, you will buy local. You will have a prejudice for the local over the national, and the near over the far, and the small over the big, the simple over the complex. And down in the footnotes, where I argue also in sans serif type, we argue for personal being quite a bit better than corporate, and physical somewhat better than abstract. We're brought to you by Nooganomics.com, our website, the website for the man who mattered. David Tulis, the blogger with the biggest pen, the leading Nooga centrist, the guru of local economy. Dave, what is de-escalation? Why does my listener need to care about this whole concept and your work at Chattanooga Autism Center promoting the idea among law enforcement?
Right, and it's not just our center, too. There's a lot of different organizations that help out with the officers. They call us in to help with this program. So de-escalation, think of a scenario where it can go one of two ways, right? It's either going to escalate and get louder or more dangerous, or it can be de-escalated, which means it's going to be calmer and more rational. And you're going to prefer the calmer and more rational. And I think your listeners probably know what escalating is. It wouldn't take much in a situation where you can, you imagine having a conversation with a spouse or a friend, and they say something and you push their button. You say something in a different way, And of course, it's going to ramp things up. Right. Then that's not desirable. I mean, unless that's the purpose. You want to have a spirited discussion, fine. But when it comes to law enforcement or other situations too, where you're working with an individual and you don't want things to escalate or become dangerous, you de-escalate. You make the person more calm. And how do you do that? Usually you're building trust. I mean, that is the number one thing that can cause someone to become calm is they trust you. And then number two, you're being listened to. If I feel like someone is really listening to me, they're not just nodding their head, they're not just saying, I understand. They are able to repeat back the story I just told, and not through their eyes, but through my eyes. I'm going to all of a sudden realize that they are on my side. They're standing with me, not against me.
They're not repeating, the officer's not repeating your story with sort of doubts hitting the details, but he's retelling the story that you've just told him about your distress and your woe, and he's feeling it with you.
Yeah, as best you can. Sometimes it's not possible, but at least you're trying to do that. And right there in that moment, that more times than not will de-escalate a situation. It's not guaranteed. It's not a magic bullet. If we could have some robot that would do this, we wouldn't need officers. You have to have that human part of it, and there will be variances, and not everybody's going to do things the same, but that is what is going to de-escalate it. And then you can do what you want to do. Let's say this individual is potentially going to cause some harm or needs to get to a doctor, or they need to get to some other place. They're more likely to comply with that request. They might not be acting rationally. Their parents need them to get to this other place, and maybe the child is larger than the parents, or it's a single parent, or something is going on to where they need assistance. You're going to want a trained person to come in there, someone who is used to these situations and also has that empathy. They're the ones that'll be able to help you.
Well, what kind of officers have you trained, Dave Buck, in the de-escalation training here?
Yeah, a huge range of officers. That's what's kind of cool. Like I do not have training. I don't have any officer training or law enforcement training at all. So I'm always learning new things when I come into these situations and finding out the background of these individuals. But a lot of them are people out on the beat. They're driving. They are responding to crises, responding to calls. But we also work with some corrections officers, the 911 dispatch folks. We work with the folks at UTC, the law enforcement there, Collegedale, and several others. It's whoever is coming in that year. And it's really cool because they are out there, they're seeing that they could use some more tools. They could make things safer for themselves and the person that they're serving. So if you are using less force, you are less likely to get hurt yourself, let alone the consumer, of course, is less likely to get hurt. And so they want tools and strategies that can make that go away. And the de-escalation, the taking a crisis and de-escalating it, that's how you get to that point. So each year, too, I see a change in the officers in how they approach this. It started out where you'd have a few, maybe a handful of skeptical individuals, and they're not going to do this, you feel like, whereas the majority of the class is on board. Now it feels like the entire class, not only are they on board and shaking their heads, they're asking tough questions. They'll say, Dr. Buck, how do we handle this situation? I had this happen to me. What would you do in that situation? And they're throwing me curveballs, and I'm realizing, well, they have to decide in that moment, and they want to know what can they do the next time that they're out. That shows me that they care, and they also know that it's tough out there. They want to know different tools and different ideas.
Well, give a scenario, Dave Buck, of what you're talking about. Give either a real event that you heard described, or make one up that illustrates this immediacy of the decision and de-escalation.
Yeah, sometimes it's I'll do one with the eye contact. Officers are always wondering, well, I've heard that sometimes people with autism have a hard time with eye contact, and a bit of that is a myth. They might not always have the best eye contact, but they're not going to usually be averse to someone giving you regular eye contact. Another is hallucinations. So let's say someone is schizophrenic and they're having a break from reality and they're actively experiencing a hallucination. Officers love to talk about those things. What should I do? Should I acknowledge that? Should I not acknowledge that? And we go through different scenarios, and a lot of times it depends. And so, and we have different help from different agencies who know more about that than I do, and they answer those questions. It's really a great community, and a big collaborative event.
Well, what about men and women? Are most of the people who deal with police officers who are on the autism spectrum, or who have mental problems, are they mostly men, Dave Buck? Or?
So I can only speak to the autism aspect of it. It's a 4-to-1 ratio, a little more than 4-to-1, even though women are probably underdiagnosed, but it's 4-to-1. So in that case, yeah, they're going to see more men with autism or boys with autism
in
than
these
girls.
Encounters.
Yes, in these encounters. That's right. And I mean, you could tell me more about this. I don't know what the ratio of if you're getting a police call, isn't it just in general more likely to be a male who is the reason of the call rather than a female? Is that the case? Is that, I don't know. I really don't know. If it's domestic violence, I just assume, but maybe I shouldn't assume that it's more likely being done by a male than a female, or I just don't know on that.
Last year, the sheriff's department and a former head of the chamber were trying to raise money for a private organization that had an automated, a digital shoot, don't shoot scenario machine. It was one where the officer and members of the media tried it out, would practice scenarios where on the screen is a person whose motions are unclear, whose intent is unclear, and who may or may not be pulling a gun. And I argued that that's a bad idea. There should not be training like that, because what that does, it trains the officer to think that every encounter is a shoot, don't shoot scenario. And I think that's a dangerous premise to have, and to have that drilled into you, that at any moment you could be lying dead on the ground. And what that does, it heightens the anxiety of the officer and heightens his sense that it's us versus them. And I think your training, Dave Buck, works against that model of training and policing. What do you think?
Well, the CIT program, I mean, it's only a week long, and we do pack a lot into that. And so we always get past the safety part of it. We start our training after they've determined that there is no weapon, or there is, the environment is safe, or their officer has backup or something like that. And then they go into the discussion, because the individual is still amped up, still doing something that could lead to either violence or a crime, or someone getting hurt, including the officer, or with a family or the individual. So we start with the officers after they have made things safe. And we'll even test them on a little bit if the person, let's say we're doing a scenario where the individual's cutting him or herself. They first use their training to make the weapon go away. Usually it's through request, because they built rapport. But if all the officers say, look, if that person's about to stab themselves or cut their throat, we're going to, do something to save their lives. We might stop talking at that point. But if the person is just not in danger, of the knife is to the side, or something like that. Or we've had a scenario where there was a gun. An individual had a gun in his backyard, and we based a new scenario off of it. But the officers weren't drawn down on him. They just asked him to put his weapon down, and he did. And then they found out these other issues. Since it's a real story, I don't know how much detail I can go into, but it was a mental health consumer, and they used their skills. And this
here in the county.
Yes. Yeah, I assume so. It was one of our the people in my thing. So it wasn't George, it was here. And yeah, they talked him through that. And I wonder how often that happens. That doesn't make the news.
Well, part of the de-escalation theory that Chuck Wexler at the Police Executive Research Forum proposes, there are four main parts, if you, my listener, have not been following this story. And they are the use of time, space, cover, and de-escalation that will save American lives for about 1,200 people per year, guns down in extrajudicial, I would say, summary style there, and that's because they've done something wrong. They've not complied in the proper way. They've raised a weapon, pointed a weapon, or walked toward or run toward an officer with something like a pipe in their hands, and so they're shot down. And part of the quick trigger comes from training. And an Atlantic Monthly article a couple years ago said that officers are trained. There's a mantra that you do anything you have for your own safety. You want to come home tonight to your family. That's a kind of cliche, and the officers believe that. And what that creates, Dave Buck, are two standards of self-protection, sort of self-interest in the policing profession, and that is the line in the sand. You can't cross this line. If you do, you're dead. And the other one is the idea of a kill zone, that anybody within, I think, 25 feet from you can kill you before you can draw your weapon. And so the officer is always walking around with a bubble of defiance about him. And if you come into that space, even though you're just walking toward him, he's already got his guard up and he's ready to shoot. This is David Tulis, and we're talking with Dave Buck. And caller, you're live on the air with David Tulis and Dave Buck. What's on your mind?
Well, I have a question, but a comment first. I would assume every encounter, if I was a cop, would be a deadly one. I wouldn't trust anybody, because people are all nuts. So you don't know what these nutty people are going to do. And the worst calls are domestics, where, the guy that just beat the crap out of his wife or girlfriend was called, and he comes to arrest him, and she jumps on his back and stabs him. I think, I'm just giving a suggestion. I think maybe on domestic calls, the cops should throw a gun in, and the survivor comes out a winner. Because I don't know why anyone would want to put themselves in that situation. So what are your thoughts on police being put in a situation where you have crazy people, which is right now 99% of the population, wanting to kill each other or think they have a sense of entitlement and want to call the police when they need them but hate them when they don't? Thanks.
That's not a question for me, Dave Buck. That's a question for you. Go ahead.
No, I don't think it was a productive question. I'm sorry. I don't want to respond to that. It was insulting.
Well, okay. So this is David Tulis, and we're talking with Dave Buck, the executive director of the Chattanooga Autism Center. Well, getting back to my question about these lines in the sand and the kill zones, Dave, your work seems to be one that dismantles somewhat those high barriers that officers have around them, which are defensive of their persons and their personal integrity. And what comment to that assertion, actually, please. Go ahead.
And so over the years that I've been doing this, these are things I wasn't aware of. Again, not being an officer or any training like that. I would hear it come up in questions in the training that we would provide. They would talk about some of these safety aspects and so on. But in the training itself, you didn't see that as much. The officers were given more leeway or even encouraged, once the situation is safe, to engage the individual. They didn't have these bubbles. They would get close. They would always talk about if the partner was there, make sure you're watching your partner. I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? Not talking about guns or you're going to shoot someone if they do something like that. More about, can you get away? If someone jumps at you, can you back up? Those are the comments that I've heard from the officers who talk about the tactical part.
We're talking with Dave Buck, and the number is 800-8949, 800-8949. That's 800-8949. And my name is David Tulis. We do thank you for giving us just a minute of your time here. Love your neighbor, and buy local is our theme. So, Dave Buck, the training that you give is that the officer has to view the subject, or the consumer, as you call him, with some sense of trust as well. It's not just that the individual with autism spectrum or with mental problems or drug addiction problems. It's not just that he has to trust the officer and sort of be submissive and quiet and friendly to him, but that the cop has to do it too, right? It's
so
a two-way street.
Right, and you're putting a lot on an individual that way. You're making your environment known to yourself. You're pulling all of that stuff in. You're listening to the individual, not just partly listening. You're really listening, and then you're assessing for danger, and then you're wondering what side is that person on, and then you're also trying to put yourself in their shoes. So they have a lot to do at that point, but that at least is part of the issue. They are trying to put themselves in that person's shoes. Why are they feeling scared right now? Why are they feeling frightened of me? What can I do differently to make that go away?
Well, what about disarmament? If officers did not have weapons, in many countries they don't. On the Scotland there are very few armed officers. If officers did their jobs without weapons, do you think Americans would be able to accept that, not being under an armed occupation?
Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of heard that batted around. I haven't thought about that too much. I really don't know.
Well, your efforts, Dave Buck, at the Chattanooga Autism Center and with the de-escalation course is in the direction of peace. You might say treaty making between the people and the state. The officer represents the state, and the people, the population, the commoners. That's my listener. That's me. And so we're looking at what you're doing with favor. Now, it seems what we're afraid of, I think, what the officer's afraid of in these encounters, Dave Buck, with people who are on the autism spectrum, or who have bizarre habits, perhaps, or bizarre modes of expression, or seem to be disconnected from reality. The fear is that I'm going to get shot. Right? I'm going to get shot, killed. The officer, of course, has training. He has body armor. He has multiple weapons systems on his person. He has gas. He has tasers, and so on. So if there's an encounter with someone even with a club, even with a knife, it's likely that he is going to, because he's fit, or she is fit, he is going to come out on top with nary an injury. But there's always the danger of the lethal encounter, right? The man sitting on the bench in the park, in fact, has an old snubby in his pocket, a revolver, and the officer unwittingly exposes himself and is shot dead. But it seems to me that there's a calculation that needs to be made, and my argument for police officers is that if there is a risk of a lethal encounter, that's an accident, Dave Buck. If it's an accident, better that the officer perish than that the member of the society with autism perish. And the reason is because the officer put himself in line to do that. He self-sacrificially into that profession, willing to take a bullet for someone, willing to take take a bullet, or to have an accident, to suffer injury, to save the life of a woman or a child or a man, a minority, an immigrant or a gay person or other. He's there self-sacrificially. So what you're doing, Dave, seems to me that you're trying to enlarge the scope of that thinking process in the officer's mind, that he's willing to take the risk if there is a fatal encounter, that it fall on him rather than on my listener and my listener's son or his daughter.
Yeah, I think that last part is really summing it up. If there isn't a weapon trained on you, if someone isn't actually attacking you at that moment, or they aren't like holding a knife to you, other than those situations, when safety has been established to a certain degree, then you're using your words. You're talking to the individual, building rapport, and then when you are needing to ask them to do something, you'll be able to do it. Or they are less likely, like you said, if they did happen to have a weapon on them, they are less likely to pull it out. And no one is saying, and I don't think you are either, that the officers should just walk up with nothing and just assume every single person is going to be safe. They use this right amount of caution, and with the idea that we're going to really try to use the de-escalation strategies and listen and get this person where they need to go.
Right. The risk, there is a risk. There's always a risk. But if the officer who's entered into that profession for good, he's entered with a noble heart, a great idea. He wants to help people. He wants to protect people. He wants to secure the innocent. He wants to secure property, to solve crimes, to restore lost goods, lost goods to people who have had them stolen. If there's a rapist, he wants to find the man who abused a woman, and so he enters that calling with a great idea. But practice changes that, and he becomes very. I think the training, from what I've read about Dave Buck, the training becomes very self-centered and kind of selfish. In other words, it's all about you, your safety, your security, and dare not a woman in a summer skirt hurt you with her knitting scissors, right? You're going to have to tase her and have her fall to the ground, and she may hit her head on that curb and be knocked out senseless because of that. But doesn't matter, because you've put the risk on her. I think your training suggests that the officer really needs to be open to the people and take the risk.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on every single situation. You have all of the. You could have someone who has the knitting needles and they're ready to stab the person next to him or ready to stab the officer, and the officer has to do something to prevent injury. But the situation we talk about more is that people are away. We're starting you officers at a spot where you're not going to get hurt right now. You've already taken away that threat. Now let's get that person who could maybe just be going back to their home. They haven't committed a crime yet, or they maybe need to get to their doctor to have their therapist talk to them more in depth. And you can get them there because they trust you now. The
Chattanooga Autism Center has a fundraiser in the next few days. Dave, when is it?
November 18th. Go look up the Chattanooga Autism Center Walk and please donate.
Donate Autism Center Walk. This is David Tulis. Dave Buck, thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you.
We do thank you, our listener, for giving us just a couple minutes of your time here at 92.7. These are important issues. This is a very exciting development in Chattanooga. It's not new, but you are hearing about it perhaps for the first time, and we're all learning from each other. David Tulis, looking for peace, looking for tranquility, de-escalation, treaty making, right? To treat is a verb, and from that comes a treaty. That comes an agreement, a pacification of hostilities. We need more of that in Chattanooga. David Tulis, and now some messages.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD.